So I hope you're all seeing a picture of trees. And the title of today's seminar, as you know, is The Right Tree in the Right Place. And we're going to be exploring the best ways to do tree planting within the carbon market. A few things about using this system, the Zoom system today, and netiquette. First of all, please, if you're not speaking, please turn off the camera and sound. So it'll be only the panelists, I think, today who will be seen on camera and heard. The seminar is being recorded and will be available afterwards. That means that, of course, you're very welcome to remain anonymous if you wish, and to pose questions anonymously. But if you're happy to be seen a bit, then you're welcome to change your name within the chat or within the participant list. And you do that by going to some icons near where you see yourself. But of course, you're welcome to stay anonymous. We're going to close the chat function in a minute or two, but we will open then the Q&A. So the Q&A function will be used for posing questions. I'll do my best to include your questions when we come to the panel, but it may not be possible to include them all. Thank you once again for joining us. It's wonderful to have all this interest in these topics. And it's great to see so many people, some that we know and many new people to us. And you're all very welcome from wherever you are in the world. The organisation hosting and organising this session today is Zero Mission. We are a company in Sweden, founded in 2006. And our mission today is taking companies to net zero today for a living planet tomorrow. And we do that by helping companies to measure, reduce, and offset their greenhouse gas emissions. So the reasons that we wanted to arrange a seminar today are: one, there's very much increased focus all the time on natural climate solutions. And two, what that means, because of the climate crisis, is that we must scale up these activities. But we need to do it well. We need to do it in a way that ensures environmental and social integrity. And one way to do that is through finance from the voluntary carbon market. And these are the issues we're going to be covering today. And we're encompassing all of those with the title, The Right Tree in the Right Place. So to help us explore these questions, we have one main presentation, followed by a panel discussion with four experts who represent different types of organisations and different groups of stakeholders. And I'll introduce them after the main presentation. So we go on now to the main presentation. This will be given by Professor Ed Mitchard, who will be talking to us from Edinburgh. Ed has two wonderful job titles. He is Professor of Global Change Mapping at the University of Edinburgh, and he's also Chief Technical Officer of a company called Space Intelligence. Ed, I wonder if you'd like to put up your presentation now.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Claire. And yes, thanks to all the Zero Mission team for organising this. It's lovely to be speaking to you all this morning.
Ed, I wanted to just ask one question. You have these fantastic technical sounding job titles, but I get the impression that actually trees are your thing, really. Am I right?
I've definitely spent a lot of the last 15 years measuring trees in tropical countries. So I guess I'm an expert in the amount of carbon stored in tropical forests and trying to quantify that, but also trying to help stop deforestation and help with restoration projects. So yeah, I guess I'm a scientist. I spend a lot of time dealing with satellite data and ways to analyze satellite data better. But yes, I'm in it for the trees, and I consider myself a forest ecologist fundamentally.
Fantastic. Thanks very much. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Claire. So yes, thank you very much for being here today. So I have a presentation. I'm going to talk about why I think that businesses should offset with tropical trees. There's been some controversy around this recently, so I'm keen to talk about the situations where paying to plant trees is a good idea, and maybe situations where it's not such a good idea. But overall, I think it is something we should be supportive of. So start kind of by zooming out and thinking about climate change in general. So I wanted to begin by pointing out that businesses produce the vast majority of carbon emissions. This is a nice figure showing the carbon emitted by different sectors. I think these numbers are from 2016, but in terms of proportions, nothing really has changed before this very weird year when things might be slightly different. But overall, 3/4 of the carbon that we pump into the atmosphere each year is related to energy, broadly considered. About a third of that from energy use in industry, another third of that from transport, and another third from businesses, plus some other smaller bits. In all three of those cases, really, it is companies doing most of those emissions. The other major section, about 20% of emissions, is related to agriculture, forestry, and land use. Most of that really is tropical forest deforestation and degradation, so people cutting down trees to clear new land. All of these things are largely related to things companies are doing. They may be driven a bit by individuals through buying food or choosing to fly somewhere. You're causing some of these emissions. But as consumers, we don't really have choice to avoid those emissions, unless you live a very aesthetic life sitting in your house and doing very little to interact with the economy. If you go out and buy food or buy products, you are causing emissions through the emissions that the companies themselves have chosen. Governments have a big role to play. Governments do spend a lot of money and can have some control over things like the power grid of countries, so they do have a role here. But governments ultimately aren't the people making the decisions day to day about the supply chains and the production of goods and services. That is companies. Governments have a role through regulation. They can poke companies into doing the right thing or changing a bit. But really, I think that it is important to understand that most of the carbon that we pump into the atmosphere is done by corporations, and therefore a lot of the responsibility for doing something about it is the actions that companies take. And companies really care about what consumers think. So there is a role for consumers in nudging companies. But I think there's a danger in worrying too much about consumer choice. I think there are choices consumers can make, but we've seen the limits of those, I think, in this pandemic a bit. So flying and transport is down massively this year. And other economic activities has been derailed a lot. Here in Scotland, I'm not allowed to leave Edinburgh, so never mind how much I want to drive my car to the mountains of the Highlands, I'm not allowed to do that. But emissions are barely down this year compared to 2019. So a lot of the function of the global economy is outside my control as a consumer. A big thing I can do is to eat less meat. That maybe affects a bit of the energy and a bit of the agriculture and forest and land use boxes. It's probably the biggest consumer decision I can make, but we're still not going to solve climate change overall by eating less meat as consumers. It needs to be a transformation of the global economy, which what that really means is companies doing different things. So overall, to fight climate change, we have to get to this so-called net zero fast. This doesn't mean necessarily removing all emissions from our supply chains, for our economy, but it does mean overall having no net addition of carbon to the atmosphere quite quickly. To show you why we have to take carbon out of the atmosphere as opposed to just cutting emissions, I have this nice figure from the IPCC. This shows the pathway to get the world to a 1.5 degree, only 1.5 degree of warming through emissions cuts. You can see if we'd started to take this seriously back in 2000, we'd have been able to follow this trend here and fairly gradually cut emissions down towards somewhere near zero by something like 2070. That would have led to emissions of only 1.5 degrees. However, we didn't take that path. Emissions carried on rising from 2000 right up to pretty much the present day. And that means we have a much steeper trajectory if we do everything by emission cuts. We would have to get to that near zero point before 2040. It's just about possible that could happen in some developed economies, but not even realistically, there is just no way that that's going to happen across the global economy. So in practice, this transition that we need to do to keep the world at 1.5 degree warming is too steep, and instead, therefore, we need economies to definitely cut their emissions. That's essential, but also we need to start sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere to try and get to the equivalent of this line. Ultimately, what we will need to do is have negative emissions now. We need to start developing parts of the economy a lot faster that do allow us to suck all the carbon we put into the atmosphere out. And we'll need to do a lot of that from 2050 onwards, even for 2-degree scenarios. The prediction is that we'll need a big industry taking carbon out of the atmosphere from 2050 to 2100. That's to correct for the extra emissions we've done over the last 150 years to get the atmosphere back to something a bit more normal. But also because we will carry on emitting from 2050 to 2100. There is no way humans can exist on this planet at the level we have without causing some carbon emissions. It's just some things that are going to be really hard to move onto a low carbon economy. For example, our power grids, it's very easy to see how those transition from fossil fuel burning to renewables. We've made great strides with that, probably faster than we'd have predicted 10 years ago. So that's great. Transport, we are beginning to move across. So there's more and more electric cars around. Those electric cars still have emissions related to their creation and currently related to their use across most of the world. It's still burning some carbon. And other bits of the transport economy are much harder to move across. Aeroplanes running off batteries is quite far-fetched from a science point of view. That may change, but either we have to stop flying or we have to do something to move that across to low carbon. And other bits of the economy are much harder to move across entirely. For example, cement manufacturer, I'm sure will still need cement in 2050 onwards. It's hard to see how you produce cement with no carbon emissions. So I think companies must do something to offset additional emissions. And actually, that's great news because companies have most of the money that exists in the world. So even a small part of their revenues being put towards doing good things for the planet in terms of nature-based solutions can make a massive difference. I've put this figure up to show the size of the global economy. This is 2018, I think. So again, it shouldn't change too much apart from this weird year. And this is to show that it's the global rich companies that have the global developed countries that have most of the world's firepower in terms of company assets and revenues. So the United States is the largest weird-shaped polygon here. You see the EU countries, UK in the right in the green, other large economies. These are where most of the companies have, and these numbers are in trillions of dollars. In the carbon market terms, we don't normally talk in trillions. Even billions of dollars would make an enormous difference because currently the things we do in terms of restoring forests are market sizes of tens and hundreds of millions of dollars, which sound like large numbers, but in the scale of a global economy and a global climate crisis, they're not that big. So if we can persuade companies to do the right thing in terms of cutting their own emissions, but then to use some small residual part of their earnings to try and offset the remaining carbon emissions, that can make a massive difference to climate change. Get us on some of those pathways towards 1.5 or 2 degrees of warming rather than 4 or 5 degrees of warming. So if you are a company and you've done everything you can to reduce the carbon in your operations and your supply chain, so you're buying only your electricity from a renewable energy provider, you've retrofitted your office building to reduce the amount of heating that you have to use, you've changed your fleet of cars to everyone taking public transport where possible, and then doing everything else with electric cars, you're still going to have some emissions. That will vary by sector. If you're an oil major, you're going to have a lot of emissions at the moment. If you're a company where most people are currently working from home, your emissions will be smaller, but every company will still produce some carbon emissions. And if you want to offset those to get to net zero, which I believe companies should be doing, then you have a choice of voluntary sector options available. I've got some carbon standards on the left, and this is the latest figures I could find on where the kind of volume and price of different offset options are. You'll see the biggest by volume is forestry and land use. So that's either planting new trees or protecting forests that was going to be cut down. Similar size as renewable energy. This is funding basically developments in electricity grids to go towards renewables. Waste disposal is mostly working with places that get rid of rubbish to try and stop methane going into the atmosphere, typically ending up burning rubbish to produce energy. Household devices is things like cook stoves, more efficient ways of using fuel to reduce emissions. And then there's some other more minor ones, which I won't go through. So forestry, well, all of these have a wide variety of price variation. This average price, $3 a ton, feels very low because some kind of more beneficial projects often have much higher carbon prices, nearer $10 or $20 a ton for planting trees in some parts of the world. So companies have a lot of choice about what type of project they want to support and what co-benefits they want. So funding a wind turbine development in Scotland would be good for reducing emissions and will have some economic benefits, but it's not going to create the same number of jobs as funding thousands of farmers in Uganda to plant trees, as Pauline might talk about later with her project. They'll also vary, I think, in the level in which they are actually offsets that will suck carbon out of the atmosphere. That is something that the whole economy can take on and scale up to produce the kind of negative emissions we will need. Converting the world to renewable energy is a good thing, but it's reducing extra emissions from somewhere else of the economy. It's not actually sucking any carbon out. Similarly, with waste disposal or household devices, all of these things are reducing future emissions. They're not actually taking carbon out of the atmosphere. That's also true with some of the forestry credits. A lot of these are so-called red credits. They're credits for reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation. That is taking an area of forest that is at high risk of being cut down and protecting it. So that's stopping future emissions, which is a good thing to do. We want to stop that green part of the pie chart I showed you earlier from deforestation. Criminally stupid that we're still cutting down forests. In 1992, as part of the Rio Climate Summit, we said we would stop deforestation, and we've cut down about 10% of the world's remaining tropical forests since 1992. Releasing all that carbon to the atmosphere. So that's something we must stop. But it's not taking new carbon out of the atmosphere. We can't do this negative emission just by stopping emissions from sectors like that. Planting trees, which is part of that blue box, is actually scaling up an option that will suck new carbon out of the atmosphere to replace past deforested land with new forest. So there's lots of talk about nature-based solutions. Other words exist, which in general mean forest restoration. There are other ways of doing nature-based solutions to climate change, for example, peatland restoration. But forest restoration is far away the cheapest and most rapid way to remove carbon from the atmosphere. Peatlands take a very long time to build up carbon storage. Trees in some parts of the world grow incredibly quickly. They're very efficient at taking carbon out of the atmosphere. And also in some cases can be very cheap because you can effectively leave land to restore itself. Trees come back very quickly. There's lots of land available for restoration, supposedly, some caveats on this. This is a map produced by the World Resources Institute of Forest and Landscape Restoration Opportunities. You particularly want to look at the green colors here. So these are for wide-scale restoration and mosaic restoration in lighter green. Mosaic restoration is where a landscape, for example, with smallholder farmers in it, there's potential for adding some trees to that area, for example, through agroforestry or border parting, but probably not converting the whole area back to forest. You see there's lots of green areas across the tropics, also quite a lot in Europe, unsurprisingly, because some countries, for example, my own, Scotland, has cut down most of its forest cover. So there's clearly potential for increasing that forest cover in the future. And there's a fewer opportunities in the far northern hemispheres, often for remote restoration. This is where actually going and planting trees is probably not a good idea, but leaving the areas alone to slowly regenerate could work. Some of this land identified probably isn't really empty. The WRI does caveat their map. It's the starting point. It's not a detailed survey for each country. So some of it may have active agriculture going on or people using that land quite intensively. But it's clear that there are hundreds of millions of hectares, up to 2 billion hectares available. That's about twice the area of India, available easily for restoration, that is currently not being used very well. Often this is land that was cleared for agriculture or for pasture, but since then abandoned. But not all tree planting is equal. And there are big questions about where you do it. Do you do it in northern hemispheres near to where these companies' headquarters, or do you do it in the tropics? What do you plant? Do you plant plantations that might provide a product that's very easy economically. If I go and set up a plantation for the teak, then I know that in the future I have a market for teak, and I might capture some carbon and restore some forest at the same time. Is that equal to leaving an area alone to naturally regenerate, or trying to plant native species to speed up the process? And how much should I prioritize co-benefits, so social and biodiversity benefits, or is that not the right thing to do? And if I have $10,000 to spend on trees, should I be spending that money to get the most tons of carbon out of the atmosphere, rather than to also do a kind of aid project as well that reduce the amount of carbon? These are difficult questions. I don't have all the answers. We'll discuss them more, I think, in the panel. But I'll give some thoughts on this. So one of them is that tree growth rates vary greatly with latitude. So in the tropics, it's wet and hot, sunny all year round. So in general, you have carbon sequestration rates, which are really quite scary in some cases. So up to 6 tons of carbon per hectare per year across lots of tropical forest areas. That means that a reasonable looking forest might have 50 tons of carbon per hectare. So that would be something with trees 15 meters tall that definitely gives 100% shade cover and has a lot of the function of forest. So that means that can turn up in 8 years in the tropics, which is just incredible compared to planting a tree where I live in Scotland. This does drop off quite markedly as you go towards the northern latitudes. So where I am in Scotland, you'd be lucky to get 0.5 ton of carbon per hectare per year, apart from for a commercial plantation where you're really looking after the trees. And further north still, you're getting down to, well, the bottom color of this graph is 0.058 tons of carbon per year. So that would be taking 100 years to get to the 6 tons of carbon per hectare per year you have in 1 year in the tropics. So it's a very big difference here. I just wanted to show this a bit. On the left is a picture from a reforestation project in Peru. These are 4-year-old trees, and you see they're well over 10 meters. These have grown very well indeed. In Scotland, here's a rewilding project, which is great. That's trying to add birch and other seedlings to this glen and watch them grow. But this is 4 years of restoration work in this Scotland glen, and you see that the trees are not yet as high as the happy rewilder. So clearly there's a very big difference in growth rates. It may be that the forest that arrives eventually in Scotland and Peru in this case has a similar biomass. Probably the tropical forest gets to a higher peak carbon storage than Scotland, but actually the highest biomass forests in the world are not found in the tropics. They're found in places like the west coast of the US, where you get these really tall, really big trees. But if it takes hundreds of years to get there, that's not very helpful for climate change, because it's not the peak carbon that really counts. It's the carbon that you store in the next 10 or 20 years that's really going to help us with climate change. So yeah, the end result of the restoration is important for other things, but if you're going to grow your trees very slowly, that's much less useful than trees that grow fast in terms of reducing the emissions that you're trying to offset as a company. You're really pumping carbon out of your cars or out of your heating system for your building this year. So in order to take that carbon out, you really want to remove that carbon from the atmosphere this year. You don't want to remove it over the next 100 years. That's not equivalent. And there will still be significant heating as a result of the ton of carbon that you've released this year if you're only slowly removing it. The other big factor is something called albedo. This is the amount of solar radiation that bounces back out of the Earth once it comes in. This is fairly constant across much of the globe. So when the sun comes in, maybe 20% or so is reflected off the surface, but it varies greatly depending on what the ground surface looks like. If you imagine if I put a big mirror in my garden, then we'd have a very high albedo because lots of that solar radiation would bounce straight off. We don't have many natural mirrors, but we do have glaciers and snow cover across some of the Earth. And that is very good at reflecting solar radiation. Up to 90% of solar radiation is reflected off a snow surface. That means that the Earth, and particularly its poles, are much colder than they would otherwise be. And it's one of the reasons that the poles of our planet are heating much faster than the tropics or where we live, because as global warming happens a little bit, ice and snow start to melt and are there for less of the year, or the frozen water that normally covers the North Pole is freezing later. And that means that more solar radiation gets into that area, and it's a positive feedback. The increase in albedo means temperatures rise, which means less snow and ice, which means more increase in albedo. So it's a big problem. It's one of the non-linearities that makes climate change so scary, because you raise temperatures by a little bit, and suddenly it starts to run away with you and rise temperatures more quickly. So when you plant trees in the tropics, you get very little difference in albedo. This slightly complicated looking figure on the right-hand side of the slide is worth a little bit of time to explain. Along the bottom, we have the months. So this is 1 to 12, so January to December. And then you read this graph going up and down, looking at latitude. So it goes from just over 60 degrees north, the highest latitude you'd ever have trees, down to almost 60 degrees south. And the colors, so in blue, colors means that albedo would be increased by adding trees, and going towards red colors means albedo is reduced by adding trees. So you particularly see in the northern left, so most of the graph is kind of yellowish. These little crosses mean the changes are insignificant, so you don't care about whether the color's yellow or blue. Basically, trees aren't making any difference. So across much of the tropics, adding tree cover doesn't change anything. Trees are very similar to non-trees in terms of their albedo. But because in the far northern latitudes there is snow for a lot of the year, you do get a big difference, because the trees typically sit on top of the snow, and they're adapted to make snow fall off their branches, so they don't get snapped by having the weight. So in the far northern latitudes in winter, so January, February, November, December, you get a big difference in albedo, maybe up to minus 0.3, so much more heat being captured. And this typically means that from about 40 degrees north, 50 degrees north, I'm at 50 degrees approximately here in Edinburgh, and a lot of Sweden, where lots of you are from, is clearly further north than that. Planting trees may capture carbon, albeit slowly from the atmosphere, but overall, planting trees will heat the earth more than cool the earth, despite that carbon storage, because of change in albedo. So this is something that we have to consider. Often carbon offsets are calculated simply in terms of the carbon captured, because it's very nice to think that if you're emitting 10 tons of carbon, you buy 10 tons of carbon offsets. And that's fine based on albedo if those trees are being planted in low latitudes. But if those trees are being planted in high latitudes, that may not be fair. Okay, you've replaced your carbon storage eventually, but overall you may have warmed up the planet through those additional trees by covering snow that would otherwise be there. So what you choose to plant is also important. We did an analysis looking at something called the Bond Challenge, which is an institutional effort from lots of countries, 43 countries currently, to try and restore 350 million hectares of forest by 2030, which is great. I'll talk slightly more about it later. But we did some simulations about what was the amount of carbon that would be captured by this pledge, depending on what was done. So currently, in the middle of this figure, this is what countries are planning to do. So some of them are planning to protect areas and let natural forests regenerate. Some are planning to use agroforestry, and some are planning to turn the land into active plantations. And we estimate that 16 petagrams of carbon will be captured by this, as long as the new natural forest is protected, or only 3 petagrams of carbon if the natural forest isn't protected. So beyond 2050, it gets converted to something else. To put these numbers in perspective, by the way, we release about 10 petagrams of carbon per year in fossil fuel burning. So 3 petagrams would be a third of a year of emissions captured by this 350 million hectares. Clearly not going to make much difference. If instead we convert all of this 350 million hectares into natural forest, basically we do a bit of assisted regeneration, but mostly just kind of leave the areas alone, and then protect the new forest that comes up, then we would store 42 petagrams of carbon, which is a large amount. So that's 4 years of current emissions. That's going to make a difference. Look at the other side, if we convert it all to plantations, which capture carbon quite quickly, but then get cut down and the products get used elsewhere, so a lot of that carbon ends up going back to the atmosphere, we only store 1 petagram of carbon. So what you choose to plant is clearly very important. And based on this analysis, natural regeneration, so returning these lands to full-scale forest cover, or if not that, then something where the trees, once they're created, there's incentives to keep them there for the long term, is how you store the most carbon. The costs and co-benefits also vary with the country. So trees really shouldn't replace prime agricultural land. In some areas of the tropics, you can kind of win this because you can use agroforestry, so planting trees on land that's currently used for agriculture, and actually increase yields. In the tropics, you have so much solar radiation that the additional shade from trees often helps, and trees can help as well through, for example, capturing nitrogen in the soil. But where I live, in much of the northern hemisphere, if it's a binary choice, really, you either have agriculture on land or you have forest. And if we replace agriculture with forests, you might feel great as a farmer or a landowner looking out on your new forest that you've created that's captured carbon. But we have to produce a certain amount of food, and that may well mean there's another area forest is being cut down to create new farmland. It would be great overall if we could reduce the amount of agriculture we have through intensifying farming, and therefore end up with a lot more natural habitats. But you can't guarantee that as a company. So number one thing you should not do is get rid of land that's currently being used to produce food. The tropics is more biodiverse than elsewhere. So if you're restoring forest in Scotland, where I am, you're probably adding 3 or 4 species of tree. That might have some other knock-on effects for more species of insects and mammals, but it's still not going to be hugely biodiverse. If you're restoring forests in the Peruvian Amazon, then you might be adding thousands of tree species and knock-on effects to hundreds of thousands of insects and other things. So there's more species saved, or more species in general created through using restoration in the tropics. That's not the only reason. We're not doing this restoration for biodiversity in this presentation, really. We're only talking about carbon, but it is relevant. Land and income are cheaper in the tropics. Companies work on budgets normally, not on tons of carbon. There may be changes due to this, but I suspect in most cases, a company has a fairly fixed amount of money they can spend on restoration. And fundamentally, you're going to be able to do things over more land and plant more trees for the same amount of money in tropics, because developing countries are normally cheaper to operate in than developed countries. There's also supposedly more land available in the tropics based on these global analyses. So note the caveats I talked about earlier. Also, carbon finance is more likely to be able to bring people out of poverty in developing countries. I have experience, for example, in Mozambique and Uganda and others, where the payments from carbon that farmers get make a real difference to their livelihoods. So wonderful talking to people who say that due to the payments, they've planted these trees on their land, they like these trees, they provide them with fruit and they're helpful. But also the carbon payments have let them increase the time that their children are able to stay at school, or get them a new roof for their house. This kind of thing, small amounts of money, small amounts of money normally, carbon payments, can make a real difference to people's income in these developing places. Companies should be very proud of the changes they can make to people's lives. Trees in the tropics can also increase the resilience of local communities to climate change. On the right-hand side of this slide, I have a figure from the same paper as we saw before. This is talking about the changes in land surface temperature that you have between having forest and non-forest at different latitudes. We see in the same bits where you increase albedo, naturally you increase temperature. So that's in the winter. In the far northern hemispheres, you increase temperature by having trees. So that's going to accelerate climate change, as I talked about. But interestingly, in the tropics, these colors all go blue. You go up to about 10 degrees cooler through having trees as opposed to not having trees. Certainly throughout much of the tropics and subtropics, you have a cooling effect throughout the year for having forest cover. Now, in a world where we're warming the tropics, where low likelihood we're going to get 2 or more degrees of warming, increasing tree cover helps a bit with that. So that reduces local temperatures and gets us back to where we should be a little. So that's a very good thing and has a real effect on the quality of people's lives, or whether they're even able to carry on living where they live now. Trees also stabilize things in general, reduce the negative effects of climate change. So for example, this is a road in China where there has been a big landslip as a result of heavy rain. You'll notice that this landslip only occurred in the area where there wasn't trees up the hill. The bits of where trees were on the slope that protected and stabilized the slope. All of this will be the same soil type, it will have the same pressure, but having trees on a slope stabilizes that slope. They also tend to help soils hold more water. So in a hurricane going over, trees will help store water there, preventing it all running off and flooding the land as much. Similarly, in a drought, a forest can hold more water there. Forests even create rainfall, so it's estimated that about half of the rain that falls on Argentina is only there because there's forest in the Amazon. As we slowly reduce that forest area, the amount of rainfall and the seasonality changes in southern South America. Trees are very important for climate, and having more trees will often help counter some of the negative impacts of climate change. There's also evidence that countries in the tropics are actually doing this restoration. It's really happening. So this Bonn challenge I talked about, this pledge to restore 350 million hectares of forest by 2030. Most of those pledges are by tropical countries. And there was a progress report in 2018 from a handful of these countries where people went out with the countries and actually saw how much restoration had happened. And you see that a lot of these countries, so Brazil, El Salvador, Mexico, Rwanda, and Sri Lanka, have done quite large areas of restoration already. This is only a few years into the Bonn challenge. Most of the developed countries on this, I don't think, have made such big progress. It's a bit of evidence that having land that is available and a will to do it at a country level has really worked. So to conclude my talk, and before we move on to the panel, I believe that businesses should reduce emissions first as much as they can. Offsetting is not something you should do instead of reduction. Reduction of emissions is the most important thing. But of the bits that you cannot reduce away, you should offset them as a company. If all companies were to do that, we'd end up needing far more carbon offset credits than we could possibly produce at the moment. So it's a challenge for people like Zero Emissions. I saw some Plan Vivo on the call and others. We need to increase the scale of and the ambition of restoration projects to be able to meet that demand, which I hope will turn up. But that demand is only going to turn up if consumers and influence encourage companies to become carbon neutral or carbon positive. We need lots of countries, lots of companies to become net zero or carbon positive companies soon in order to meet the country-wide goals of becoming net zero, because there are some bits of the economy that are very difficult to see how those become climate neutral otherwise. And offsetting should include tropical tree planting. It's the only method I can see that current technology, large scale available, that sucks carbon actively out of the atmosphere, and it can be scaled up in a big way. I would be advocating it anyway, but from a pure carbon climate change point of view. But fortunately, it has all kinds of other co-benefits in terms of people on whose land these trees will be planted, benefiting from those trees being there and benefiting from the money coming into their communities. So it's a win-win. It's a great thing to do, and I think we should all be encouraging companies to pay for more trees to be planted in the tropics, to offset all the trees that we've cut down over the last 100 years in the tropics. Right, thank you very much for listening, and let's get to the panel.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you very much. I'd like, actually, before we go to the panel, just to ask you a couple of things.
Of course.
I was struck by a couple of points in your presentation that I'd not heard before. One, perhaps we could just check those. So check that I understood correctly. You talked about
Claire is a real expert.
Well, we'll see. You talked about the difference between the growth of trees in the Nordics and in the tropics, and you made a comparison of 100 to 1 in terms of growth or sequestration. Was that carbon sequestration, or what was that?
That is carbon sequestration, so it's the amount of carbon captured per year. I mean, that was the most extreme bits of my scale, so comparing the pixel with the fastest growth rate and the pixel with the slowest growth rate. So it wouldn't be as bad as that necessarily for the average in Sweden, but certainly a 10 to 1 ratio is there. In the tropics, it's not unusual to see 5 or 6 tons of carbon per hectare per year being captured. That's quite normal for not even a plantation, just forest restoration. Whereas plantations in our part of the world, in Sweden or Scotland, very rarely get to 1 ton of carbon a year, and that's in the best scenario.
I mean, that is an astonishing difference. I've seen trees in the tropics myself, and it is amazing. But another point you made about the difference was about something about that trees. If you add trees to a landscape in the tropics, you tend to cool the local environment. But if you add trees to a landscape in the northern parts of the planet, then you tend to warm the local environment. Is that, did I understand also that correctly?
You understood that entirely correctly. I mean, again, you've spent time in the tropics, so you'll know this. In the middle of a hot day, you go to the shade of the trees, but it's not just the shade that cools you down. The whole area where there are trees, because it's transpiring water, has a lower air temperature. So it's very common to go to a patch of forest if you want to cool down in a hot tropical day. And a few degrees can make a big difference. And we say it's up to 10 degrees cooler in areas of forest compared to areas of non-forest in the tropics. So part of the warming of the local environment is really due to that tree cover. And the reason for the warming is particularly in northern latitudes is due to the change in snow cover in winter. So because you haven't got snow reflecting all the solar radiation, you end up with trees that can absorb that heat. And trees want to do that, right? This is evolution in action. They don't want to be covered in snow because that means they can't photosynthesize and the weight can break their branches. So they're adapted for snow to drop off. And they're adapted to be really dark colors to take in solar radiation because trees don't want to freeze. So this is entirely to be expected. The biggest problem for a tree in winter is how cold it is, and the sun is the way of getting warm. So they're trying to warm themselves up.
Okay, that's great. Thank you for explaining that so well. Please do, to everyone else, use the Q&A. We have a question from Eric, which I'll try and come back to, but I'd like to introduce the other members of the panel next. So joining Ed, we have 3 experts from different sectors. We have Kai Turek. Perhaps you can turn on your video, Kai. So Kai is the Chief Reputation Officer and Chief Sustainability Officer at Sweden's best loved burger chain, Max Burgers. Welcome. I think it's fair to say that you represent a business wanting to do its very best for the climate. And we have Pauline Nantongo Kalunda. Are you visible, Pauline? Pauline is Executive Director, hi Pauline, of the Environmental Conservation Trust in Uganda. That's a large environmental NGO, and she runs a big tree planting project of the type that Ed has been describing. And then finally, a warm welcome to Björn Anderberg, who is a journalist and editor of Aktuell Hållbarhet, which is the leading newspaper in Sweden, news site for sustainability professionals. So I'd like to start with you, Pauline. Good morning. And,
good morning, Claire.
Good morning. You run a tree planting project in Uganda that's certified for carbon offsetting. So you're working every day with planting trees in the tropics. It'd be great if you could just say a few words about that. I have 2 slides for you, which I will share.
Thank you, Claire. Good morning, everybody. And thank you very much for having me on this great panel. I just want to highlight to the fact, or to speak, first and foremost, thank you very much, Ed, for such an elaborate presentation. I just want to highlight to the fact that, yes, the biophysical characteristics are very important, the location and the conditions within that area, but it's much more than those biophysical characteristics. And Ed did speak to some of those characteristics. I come from an organization that is implementing a cooperative offsetting scheme where tens of thousands of different smallholders from Uganda are growing trees in different systems. If you could go to the next slide. And that next slide, the participants are very diverse. And each and every one of these participants come with expectations, or they come with interests. Now, in addition to the biophysical characteristics, the ability to meet these expectations also determine the right tree in the right place. In that picture, you have, in the middle, you have a buyer or buyers, or the market, represented by Johanna from Zero Mission. And they have an interest. Their interest is to buy the most high quality carbon credit. Yet on the right, on my right, you have the lady in the blue skirt whose interest is to generate fodder for her animals. And then on the other side, you have the gentleman whose interest in going into the business of growing trees is to produce honey, to generate money, to look after their family. So you have this diverse set of stakeholders that have interests, which if you kind of like dictate what trees to grow in what area, you may not be able to meet their interests, and therefore it will cease to be the right tree, or it will be the right tree, but wrong place because it doesn't meet the needs of the smallholder that is growing the tree. Because whichever way you look at the carbon income, which however big the carbon income may be, at the end of the day, it is the benefits from the land use itself that will determine the sustainability of the program. So you do not know whether you have the right tree in the right place until the landowner finds that tree as the most suitable tree to meet the needs of that landowner. But then the needs of that landowner will not be met if the income or the investment capital to enable the growing of those trees is available. Then you will not have access to the market, you will not have access to that investment capital if the quality of carbon does not meet the market stakeholders. So it's a very delicate balancing act from the perspective of the intermediary, of the perspective of an honest broker like EcoTrust, to balance the needs of the market with the needs of the landowner. But in the middle there, also EcoTrust has interests. As a conservation organization, our interest is in balancing the livelihoods with the biodiversity. How do you make tree planting so lucrative, or agroforestry or forestry as a land use so lucrative that the landscape will continue providing environmental services of biodiversity conservation, environmental services of catchment management, and so on and so forth. So this whole arrangement of the right tree in the right place, it's very dynamic, and it requires all stakeholders to listen to each other and to be considerate of each other's needs, and the right intermediary to be able to meet the needs of stakeholders from a broad spectrum. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pauline. Excellent. Thank you for a good introduction to your approach. I would like to bring in Kai at this point. Kai, you represent a company that invests quite a lot of money in these kind of tree planting projects. I wonder what kind of odd comments you get about that. What do people wonder about? For instance, do they wonder why you don't plant trees in Sweden instead?
Yeah, that's a quite common question I get, and I have had that since at least 2008. And I mean, the straightforward answer I usually come up with is that there's nothing to buy. We don't have Swedish offsetting at all that is certified and third-party verified. So that could kind of get them off the hook easily. But also it's the things that Ed brought up here, of course, that it's much more efficient in many ways to buy it from other parts of the world. So we will get more credits for the money. We will get more co-benefits for the money. So reducing poverty, erosion, drought, increasing biodiversity, all of that happens more in the tropics than could have happened here.
Thank you. Great. I would like to just mention that just last week, there was a big task force on the voluntary carbon market, which suggested that voluntary carbon market should be scaled up by 30% every year for the next 10 years. So I'd like to hear perhaps from Ed and then from Pauline and Kai. What do you think about that? Is this something that's feasible? What challenges might we face along the way? Maybe with Ed first.
I'm a scientist who can tell people what they should do, but I don't really know the economics of how it can be done. I think it's a massive challenge to scale up any technology as fast as we need. So yeah, 30% per year I've seen as the kind of cumulative increase we need in terms of carbon sequestration from nature-based solutions. And I see increased interest as more companies getting into this clearly, and companies are expanding their operations. But that feels very ambitious, and I think we need, well, clearly there needs to be funding to go into it, and hopefully if carbon companies start offsetting emissions more and more, that money will flow in. But yes, I think it's a challenge at all stages of that's change.
But is it feasible on the ground? Do we have the land?
It's definitely feasible. I mean, especially in the tropics, trees just come back really quickly. So if you really wanted to do this globally, you could stop cutting down forests, and you could pay local landowners and farmers to leave land alone. So for example, in the arc of deforestation in Brazil, if you left that land alone, a lot of forests would come back very quickly. Trees grow back, especially where they were only been deforested quite recently. So it's possible to scale that up. Pauline and her charity have done good work in proving you can roll out a model in terms of agroforestry across a really wide area, thousands of farmers, scale that up. Again, they have a model that's works. We developed this market over the past 20 years or so. So I think it is feasible, but it would need a massive amount of money and real will from many different actors to make that happen.
Thank you. And what do you think, Pauline, about that? Are you ready to scale up 30% every year on year for 10 years?
Well, yes, of course, we are ready to scale up, and we have so many communities interested in joining the program, both within Uganda as well as in other parts of the world. However, the biggest challenge here is the competing needs. Just like climate change is a need, and people need land to grow trees or to set trees aside to be able to do the job. We also have other needs. We have a lot of interest from multinationals, sugar growing companies, oil and gas developments, and so on and so forth, who are interested in the same land. So we will need the cooperation of every stakeholder. We will need governments, private sector, civil society, to be able to understand that these are shared resources that require joint solutions. And therefore, plan all these developments in such a way that you leave room for all the necessary developments. There is enough land, but there is also a lot of scramble for that land. And therefore, we would have to bring all stakeholders on board to be able to plan for it effectively. But also, we would need to raise a lot of capacity in different countries. Like I said, it's a delicate balance, and one has to be on the ground to be able to make it happen on the ground. And as EcoTrust, we can't be in every part of Africa, for example. So we would need, as EcoTrust who have mastered the model, to be able to raise other EcoTrusts in other countries to be able to facilitate smallholders to participate in the market.
So lots of competing interests to be balanced and needs to be balanced. Yes, thank you. If we go to Kai there, do you, I presume, would like to encourage more companies to do the same as Max? Do you see signs of that happening, and what needs to change to get more people on board?
Yeah, I really do see more of that happening. I think when we went climate positive in 2018, it was just us and a company from New Zealand. Now we're up to 9 companies, and that means actually going far beyond climate neutral, because climate neutral can sometimes be just looking at parts of your footprint, while climate positive is looking at the whole value chain's footprint. So, and I think also I see that more companies are trying to go net neutral or net zero or climate neutral. So I think there should at least be a lot of interest from businesses to buy more voluntary offsets, and then it depends on what kind of offsets should they buy. It's hard to know, but I think why we have invested in trees are for all the reasons said, all the co-benefits and so on, but also from a pedagogical reason. People understand trees. They understand when they grow. We can see them. It becomes tangible. So I really do believe that this could absolutely be something that there was a demand for, more 30% more offsetting in the world. I can't guarantee that, of course, in any way, but I mean, the surge in interest is definitely there.
Perhaps just before we come to Björn, though, Kai, do you see any challenges with regard to how offsetting is reported on, written on, talked about, or about how tree planting is written about and talked about? Absolutely,
there's a lot of challenges in many different areas, and one is just accepting that it's too late to just reduce emissions. I don't think so. Enough people have realized that we need the trees. So they're kind of thinking, let's just stop doing the stupid things we're doing. But it's mathematics. We need all the carbon we can get from all the sources and capture it down and reduce all the things we can reduce. So we need to do everything at this stage. Another thing is of course, that's confusing to many people. There's so many varieties of carbon offsetting. And so the competence is not so high about what carbon offsetting is. And it all looks like a large mess to many people that tries to go into it. There's a lot of different standards. You can do cook stoves, you can energy projects in different parts of the world. You can do unlicensed, uncertified, not looked at from third-party revisions. But I think it's all coming together over the years anyway. It's getting better there. So, I mean, what we've done for all these years is going for certified, third-party verified, and you also have to look at the individual project. So you really need to dig into that a little bit to understand what you're investing in, at least if you're investing in large volumes, as Max are.
Great, thank you. We come perhaps to Björn, because I was referring there a little to sort of on the side there about how this carbon offsetting is reported on. And in Sweden, this has been quite a debate, and particularly around tree planting in the tropics. But I think it's interesting to understand how the media approaches this kind of questions. I wonder if you could just explain to us what gets in the news and how and when.
Well, first of all, the debate about planting trees, that was a debate that comes out of a big, from a big newspaper that had some articles about this around a year ago. And I don't think that this debate really has continued. It was for a short period of time that it was very was a lot of questions about it. In general, the problem is, if you, for instance, say that IKEA, that's a big company, says that they do science-based target, that would be a great news. And if then Volvo is saying the same thing, it will be a great news. And the next article may be that there is a trend of companies being science-based target, using science-based target. But in the next period of times, it won't be a big news anymore if companies take this kind of steps. And then as a journalist, you will take more, there will be more that you're trying to find companies that scrutinize how they do this. And then this gets more attention. And that doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of countries that is doing this the right way. It's just the way that media works, that the ones who fail gets more attention. And I don't have any solution to that. It's just the way the media logic works. And I don't see it as the media really has, it's not the role of the media to just publish every single press release about climate compensation or carbon offsetting. So so that's, you could see that as a problem, I was all while we're talking about this, I will mention that this fall I did a education for 25 local newspapers, and the general problem is that they didn't have a clue about what carbon offsetting is or climate positive is. So there is a lot of lack of knowledge. I mean, I work on a news site that reports on these things every day. So that's completely different from the way it looks, when you look at the general information that people get.
Thank you. I wonder if there are other members of the panel would agree. Do you think there is a lack of knowledge about carbon offsetting in general? Pauline, how do people understand carbon offsetting in your context?
This is one of the most abstract engagement that I've ever been part of. I remember on one of the days, the communities, one of the members, when we were explaining it to them, he asked us, okay, now I know you're not after my land and you're not after my trees. In what form and when are you coming for your carbon? Will you bring a machine and siphon it out of the tree? So yes, it's a very abstract subject. And then I think the way trees work is also too simple that sometimes it's a bit difficult to understand how this very simple photosynthesis and whatever, how the tree makes its tree, again, contributes to a very abstract trade. And even in the beginning, when we were negotiating with buyers as a broker, every once in a while I ask myself, what am I selling? You know? Yeah, but with time, you are able to understand. So there is very little that people understand it, but I have seen that the people that we work with, the farmers, at the end of the day, they can actually explain it. They have a very good understanding with it. They have a relationship with the trees. They do understand how ecological processes work, albeit in their way, but they do have potential to understand, and they can actually explain it to the world if you chose to listen to them.
Mm. Great. And we have a question actually directly to you, which I thought I'd take at this point. You mentioned, it's referring back to your previous point about the balance, getting the balance right between different needs. How do you manage those balances, needing to balance the needs of farmers and carbon markets and the ecology of your local environment and etc.?
We are guided by what they call the safeguards. At the global level, I think they are called the Cancun safeguards, where there are social considerations as well as environmental considerations. But the bottom line for us is that the farmer owns the land. In Uganda, smallholder farmers own the land. So whatever approach you are bringing must make business sense to the landowner. So for us, we start with the landowner, develop a vision for their land, and then work out how tree planting can be utilized to achieve the vision for the land. So we work backwards. We technically specify those activities that the farmer is going to do to work out the carbon quantities or the carbon or the climate benefits and the environmental benefits that are going to accrue from that specific farmer. Because at the end of the day, the farmer, they have the right to their land and they should be given the right to choose how they would like to utilize their land. And also because we understand that trees are beneficial to the land, they're beneficial to the farmer, and farmers are just like you and me. They have vision, they have interests. So it's not as if they come from somewhere and they have no relationship with the trees. So when you focus on the farmers, you realize that by technically specifying what the farmer is going to do, you'll be able to get these little parcels of carbon from very many different pieces of land. Then you aggregate it together to achieve what the market is looking for. So we take a bottom-up approach as opposed to coming from the market and dictating how the farmer should use their land.
But in Sweden, there's been some debate about whether this is kind of a fair trade, that offsetting buyers in Sweden finance trees planted on land owned by smallholders in Uganda. What would be your answer to that?
You see, the taste of the pie is in the eating. The taste of the pie is in the eating. If a Swedish buyer is looking for a high quality carbon credit and would like to buy it from Uganda, and the carbon farmer finds that by producing this very high quality, the Swedish buyer is able to pay for a cost that is reasonable to the farmer, then where does the unfairness come from? Sometimes I don't understand where all these insecurities are coming from. For me, when I'm walking on the Ugandan streets, I find beautiful fabric from IKEA. I find very tasty cheese from Ala in the supermarkets of Uganda. I buy it, I give it the price that they have put on it because it meets the quality that I'm looking for. I don't have all these thoughts of now this is coming from Sweden, or this is coming from. When I find a very beautiful cheese, tasty cheese from Uganda, I buy it. But when I find a very tasty cheese from Sweden, I buy it because it's meeting my needs. And I think that people need to understand that carbon offsetting is not like a bilateral grant whereby it's a donation and people are being forced to write their things in a certain way or to develop projects in a certain way. It's a trade. I give a service and it's only fair that I get paid for it. So for me, that is my take on it.
And I meet that narrative so often that it's like we're dumping our problem on poor countries, and we shouldn't do that. So we shouldn't buy anything from you. Somehow that's get into it, and it's really confusing since we're already dumping the carbon dioxide on the world.
Thank you.
We've already done that.
Yes.
But it's something with imagining that we're kind of exploiting people when we do that. So in Sweden, people are wondering. I mean, not all carbon offsetting works fine, I guess. But I mean, how would Max Berger's guests know that that it works out fine in Uganda?
One of the things that Max Berger's customers need to know is that when the farmer in Uganda is choosing to go into tree planting, they're really not doing it for Max. They're doing it to improve the productivity of their land. They're doing it to produce fodder for their animals. They're doing it to generate timber products that they are generating. However, the smallholder farmer in Uganda does not have the capital to invest in this. So the way they look at this carbon offsetting scheme, and that is why we are very grateful to standards like the Plan Vivo standard that have decided to hang in there and to be able to offer these credits ex ante. Because it's only when you offer these ex ante credits that you enable these smallholder farmers to be able to access the investment capital that is required to enable an investment that they themselves are interested in. So it's not so much that you're forcing farmers to put trees on their land for another country. You're enabling them by recognizing the extra service they offer through their tree planting. So for us, that's how it works. And also, because of the relationship that we have, because of the security that money will come on time, the farmer is able to use their purchase agreement as collateral to access other types of financing. So these transfers that come from Max and other buyers that we engage with is a trigger for so many other income opportunities that benefit the farmer. So it's really a very dynamic relationship that we have that is not so based on one partner having their needs met by another partner. It's a partnership where it's beneficial from both parties.
Great, thank you. We have a, sorry, go on.
Can I just jump in with a clarification there? I mean, Pauline was so clear about everything, but she used two terms that are not everyone knows about, I think, ex ante or ex post. So that just means that if we pay before it's planted or we pay after it's planted. And I think what you highlighted here, Pauline, was that when we pay before it is planted, it actually that works out for the smallholder farmers. They wouldn't have the money to invest themselves and plant the trees first.
Yes.
Okay, great.
There was also a question which in the chat, which I'd like to put. Ed, you answered it actually, but could you make some comments about this question of whether carbon neutral is kind of an okay claim to make, and about timescales and green and black carbon? You answered in the
Yeah, I haven't actually answered one of those ones, so I'll talk about it. Yeah, so timescales are a complicated thing. That comes back to what Kai was just talking about, ex ante and ex post. So when we're talking about offsetting, that's normally a company that has emitted something in the past year. So we're normally looking backwards a little bit. So they may have emitted 100 tons of carbon from their operations. If we offset that in a long way, so planting trees that might take 100 years to capture that 100 tons of carbon, then we'll cause a lot of global heating in that time. So that mismatch is a problem. Often in the carbon market, we buy ex post credits. So actually, someone has already captured that carbon over the last 5 years, funded somehow, and they're looking for money to pay for that activity that they've already done. So that's a bit like a normal transaction in some ways, that you've already made a car and you're delivering it to someone. You've already taken that carbon out of the atmosphere. So there's no mismatch in that case. That works nicely, and a lot of the market works with ex post. The real problem with ex post is it's very hard to scale up, because no one knows now what the emissions requirements will be in 5 or 10 years time, and trees take a while to grow. So for projects like Pauline's, I think the other way around, ex ante is really useful. It means that a buyer can pay now for an activity to start happening, such as expanding agroforestry or planting trees. But there will then be a slight mismatch. It's another reason for prioritizing activities that have an effect quickly. So planting trees in the tropics, you capture that carbon over the next 5 or 10 years. So quite quickly, you've taken that carbon back out of the atmosphere and have the other positive effect. We don't really agree with selling ex ante credits with a 20 or 30 or a 100-year time frame because of this mismatch. Normally, they're sold with a 5 or 10-year time frame. This actually means you get a lot of additional benefits. So for a Plan Vivo credit or project, typically you might sell ex ante for 5 or 10 years. So that's until the trees get quite big, but not as big as they're going to get. And really, your activity has funded those trees for the long term. For 30 or 40 years, they'll carry on capturing carbon. If you've not used that extra bit of carbon capture as part of your offset, you've only used the carbon that's going to be captured in the first few years.
Great, thanks. There was a related question which came up about the term offsetting. For me, having moved from Britain to Sweden, this is a little bit of a language issue, but are there any issues in English with the word offsetting and it being troublesome in terms of what you actually mean and what the claims actually are okay to say?
I'm not sure it's the claim, but I think there's this reduction in responsibility that it suggests. It suggests that you can, as a company, just get rid of the problem of your carbon emissions by offsetting all your emissions. As I tried to stress in my presentation, and as Max Burgers, as Kai has just told us, have done, the first step is to reduce your emissions where you can. So buy your energy from renewable resources, do things to your supply chain to try and reduce your emissions. That should always be the first step. We don't have enough carbon offsets. We want to try and do things, first of all, to stop carbon going into the atmosphere. Once you've done that, you will still have residual emissions. And I personally have no problem with the term offset there. It means that there's still a responsibility for the company based on the actual emissions they're producing. So the other suggestions of names don't necessarily have that connection between what the company is producing and the emissions. But I can see that there are some difficulties in terms of responsibility with the word offset. So I understand the reason for the question.
Thanks. We have a question about standards in the carbon market. There's a lot, as you heard at the beginning, there's an awful lot of interest in scaling up all sorts of things, activities, including tree planting. I wonder what we think about the role of standards at this point. Should we start with Kai, since you're communicating a lot?
Björn is raising his hand. So
I'm so sorry, I don't see that.
Okay,
Björn, please go ahead.
I try to answer this question by telling you a small story from reporting about this. Just a week ago, there was a company, there was a warehouse and lorry terminal in south of Sweden called Climate Transport that sent me a press release saying they were going climate positive. So I called them up, and it turns out that they were trying their best. They were reducing their emissions, and they were buying offset in Swedish forestry. And as you know, there is no standard for this. And in the next sentence, I tried to ask him about what they're doing with scope 3, and he told me, oh, scope 3, that's very interesting. Can you send me some information about that? Mm-hmm. So my question to myself was, should I even publish this to embarrass this little firm, or should I try to help them? It's a lot of times it's like this, that these words are used in a bad manner, and it's complicated to decide if I should publish and make a story about that they used in bad manner, or if you really should try to help these companies to do things right, because they don't want to fool anyone. They're very, they have a lot of interest in this, and they really want to do the right thing. But in this case, they get it all wrong, So it is a dilemma that a lot of companies and a lot of businesses not really have the knowledge how this different standards and different way of explaining it should be used. And when I did this seminars for news reporters and local newspapers, they had really hard to get this concept that climate positive and negative emissions is the same thing, that positive and negative means the same. So I think there is a need to really clear out this different terminology around offsetting and positive, and what we mean with all this.
It sounds like you're making a great contribution, for instance, by educating younger journalists or younger people. But how else could we do this? Where do you think the responsibility lies for this education?
I think it's important that we have standards, and we don't use words when we don't apply to these standards. I mean, that's the only way you can do. And as a journalist, you can scrutinize this, and you can look at companies, and you can write about when the standards is used in a bad manner. But the dilemma with this, as I said, you shouldn't, there's a lot of enthusiasm here, and you should. I don't want to. I still want companies really to try, not by telling everyone that they're not writing, that they're not using the right words. That's contradictory.
Counterproductive, indeed. Kai, you're involved in even trying to get standards set. Do you have anything to say about how we should be using standards on the buyer side?
Yeah, I think it's, I mean, when we talk about carbon offsetting, there are standards. So I think we definitely need to use those. I would say that's a no-brainer. Then you go into what kind of standards would you like to use, and then it becomes a little bit harder because most of them have their pros and cons. Why we went with Plan Vivo and carbon offsetting that way, planting trees, was because we looked into the projects and we saw what came out of that. So I think that's something you need to do. You have to also, at least when you buy a little bit more than a few tons, you go into the project and you say, does that look sound to me? So, but I think there's also this comment about standards in general when it comes to climate. Companies trying to do something on climate, and there are so many standards. There are standards for measuring, standards for the offsetting we talked about, but also standards that try to make a larger concept out of all of this, like the only independent international standard for climate neutral, that is the ISO 1421. That actually do exist. So I think that's a good basis for everyone talking about climate neutral, and actually everyone talking about climate positive or carbon negative as well. It means going further than climate neutral. And just say, why did we choose not the scientific term carbon negative for climate positive, Well, it was because it really didn't convey the message that normal people need to understand. This is actually what we need for the environment. It's not something that's negative for the climate to go climate positive.
Mm.
But carbon negative sounds a little bit like that. It would, and also I think we need some kind of hope around climate. So we need to imagine that we cannot just prolong the time, going slower to the cliff, to where it all gets extremely messy in the world. We shouldn't just reduce that speed. We could actually go away from that that gap, that catastrophe, and that's what we want to do with climate positive, just going in the other direction again.
Which sounds so inspiring. There's lots of people out there being inspired by it today. Yes, hello.
I just want to ask Kai, how do you react when the word is used by companies that isn't climate positive?
Yeah, I mean, that's why it's been so important for us to create this platform, the clipop.org, CLIPOP.org, where we actually show the exact criteria for going climate positive. So I think that's always confusing when they do that, but also in environmental lingo has been confusing for ages. So I think still climate positive is a little less unclear than climate neutral used to be. For not to mention miljövänlig in Sweden, good for the environment, which companies are using all the time. So we are in an evolution here. We're, as a world, as companies, as consumers, we're trying to do new things. So we're going to need new words to do that, and then we have to educate ourselves about those words. But I really want climate policy to be a standard soon. We could have stayed with climate neutral, but since that's not going to fix the climate, we wanted to go further and create a new standard. So that's always a difficult task, taking that on as from an international perspective, a really tiny burger chain. But I think the time has come for this. So, and it was great for us to get the award from UN last year in Madrid during the climate conference, where UN's climate experts looked at what we were doing and saying, that's what we want to give the Climate Action Award to. That's good.
Great. Unfortunately, we are coming to the end of our time. So I just wondered if Pauline and Ed, do you have any closing comment? Anything, perhaps a reflection from today? Anything you've even perhaps learned? Or...
Yes, I have.
Ed, you should unmute yourself. That's just a tip.
Okay, I've just on the last bit where you have concluded on the issue of standard. I just wanted to say that it further goes to say that it's a complex world, and much as standards try to standardize it, make it clear, but then for us we work with a very dynamic world where a smallholder is very experimental, whereby even when you create standards, they still love to experiment. They still love to push the boundary. Okay, I've tried it according to the standards, but what if I modify it a bit? And one of the things I really like about the Plan Vivo standard is they understand that the smallholder is experimental in nature, and therefore they make their rules rigorous, but also to enable the creativity of the smallholder to fit in. So I like the standards, and standards, and people need to understand that there is no one size fit for all. And therefore, let not some standards kind of like feel superior to others because they have their their structure in a certain way. So I think I just wanted to let that out, because sometimes the discussion in the media is because people are choosing a certain standard over another. But people just need to understand that there is no one size fit all, that we are different, and different standards meet the needs of certain stakeholders, but not necessarily all stakeholders.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
Ed, any final comment or reflection or anything you've learned from today?
Yeah, it's been a fascinating discussion. I think there's lots of variables in terms of how you capture carbon and offset it. And I think there's really a lack of knowledge among companies and certainly among the general public about these different options that companies have to make. It often seems that companies kind of come across a carbon standard or a project and go for that rather than having the knowledge to choose something from the market. It's like even among my community, carbon scientists, there's little knowledge of the different carbon standards and how they actually vary. You have to really get into the details to understand that, or the different options that are available. And I think there's probably a big work on my part and lots of us on the panel to try and increase the education and knowledge out there so that companies and consumers who ultimately drive a lot of this can make the right choices. But as Pauline says, there's not going to be one standard that rules them all. There's not going to be one type of offsetting. We need everything. To work, we need different approaches, and we need all of them. Otherwise, we're not going to fix the